This is Module 2, Mapping to Attack from a Finished Report. Let's talk about this process of applying attack to CTI that we started our training out with. In Module 1, you focused on understanding attack. Adam talked you through what attack is, some use cases, and how to apply it to cyber threat intel. Here in Module 2, we're going to start diving into how you map data to attack. And in Module 2, we're going to focus on how you map from finished reporting. Then Adam's going to walk you through how to map data from raw information, from raw incidents, for example, in Module 3. Then we'll move on to Modules 4 and 5. So this is where we are in our roadmap in this CTI training. Let's talk about, first off, why is it so difficult to map cyber threat intel to attack? This is not an easy process, otherwise why would we have training to do it? First off, it requires a shift in how we think as analysts. Think of that pyramid of pain that Adam brought up. Many of us, myself included, are used to looking for atomic indicators, things like domain names, IP addresses, email addresses. Well, as we map to attack, we have to shift up that pyramid of pain and think about behaviors, those tactics, techniques, and procedures. And if you're an analyst who has been mapping IPs for years, this can be a little bit tough to shift in your own mind. But the good news is we think it's worth it. Another thing that's tough about this is the volume of attack techniques. There are hundreds of them in enterprise attack and pre-attack. It can be really overwhelming when analysts first look at attack and we realize that. So we'll give you some strategies today where you can address that and hopefully kind of bypass that sense of being overwhelmed to help you successfully map to attack. Next up, the other thing we hear from people is sometimes they're overwhelmed by the technical detail in attack techniques. Maybe if you're a strategic level analyst, you never heard of something like run DLL 32. That's okay. Analysts come from all different backgrounds, and attack gives you so much information, descriptions of every technique that you can use to learn, even if you're not familiar with those technical details. As I said, we think this is a really worthwhile process. Even though it's difficult, the shift in that thinking that analysts have to make from indicators to behaviors is really useful to them in better understanding adversaries and learning something new. Learning those new adversary techniques that are really important nowadays to make sure you're detecting adversaries. And it also pushes them to learn more on the technical side. Maybe it's outside of their comfort level, but that's okay. So in short, yes, it is difficult to map cyber threat intel or data to attack, but we think it's really worthwhile. And hopefully after this training, you'll agree. Here's the process we recommend you follow as you're trying to map data, information, or intel to attack. Step 0, you have to understand something about attack. Adam gave you a head start with the first module of our training where he described what attack is, some use cases for it, and how to use it for cyber threat intel. Once you understand attack, you're going through your information, data, or intel. You have to start by finding the behavior. A little bit different than identifying an indicator, so we'll talk through that process. Next, you need to research the behavior. Maybe you aren't sure what it is, maybe you've never heard of it before. After you've researched it a little bit to understand it, then translate that behavior into a tactic. And there are fewer tactics than there are techniques in attack, as Adam briefed you on earlier, so this is a little bit easier than if you just jumped right to the technique finding. Next up, figure out what technique applies to that behavior. And then lastly, a really important part of the process that we'll have you optionally work through in our exercise that applies this process, comparing your results to other analysts, which helps you hedge against your biases and get better mapping. There are 2 key sources that you're going to use where you get this data or information from. First off, finished reporting, which I'm going to talk through in this module, how you map from that. And then Adam will talk you through in the next module how to map to attack from raw data. Step 0, understanding attack. Before you can map to attack, you need to know a little bit about what it is. A great place to start is with completing Module 1 of this training, as Adam walked you through what attack is, the tactics, the techniques, the structure. A great way to get analysts started is by watching an attack presentation. For example, one that I gave at SparkCon. You can find that on our Getting Started page, and it's a great overview of what attack is and some of the key use cases there. On that same Getting Started page, you'll find our philosophy paper, and then lots of blog posts, an ebook that we recently published on our Getting Started series, lots of other content that can help you understand attack. From there, I'd suggest you read the tactic descriptions, those adversaries' technical goals, things like lateral movement, initial access, and at least understand what each of those goals are. From there, just skim the techniques. There are hundreds of them, so we realize you might not have time to read each and every one. That's okay, but skim them to get a sense of what attack techniques are. You're not going to understand everything about attack. You're not going to know every technique, even if you read through them all. So encourage ongoing learning amongst your team. I know one SOC who had analysts present each week a different technique, and then they would discuss, how do we detect this? How do we mitigate that technique? So that's a great way you can kind of encourage this ongoing learning and discussion amongst your team to help you all understand attack together. Step 1 of the process, find the behavior. As I mentioned, this is a very different mindset from looking for those atomic indicators like IP addresses. Think about verbs. Think about what the adversary or the malware actually does to identify what the behavior is. For enterprise attack in particular, you might want to focus on initial compromise and post-compromise details, how the adversaries got in, what they do after they got in. It's also important to note that some information isn't the best for mapping to attack, and we'll be the first to admit that. For example, static malware analysis. If you have some assembly, x86, some analysis from IDA Pro, those aren't always behaviors. Some of them are, but if you're just looking at assembly, that might not map to attack very well. Similarly, infrastructure registration information. If there are some people doing some great work on passive DNS, other things like that, that might not be the best for mapping to attack. Again, we're looking at behaviors. And also important information, if you're mapping to the diamond model, things about victim targeting, also relevant for cyber threat intel, but maybe not the most relevant for mapping to attack. So really focus on those behavioral details. That's going to give you the best bang for your buck as you map to attack. So let's take a look at an example of how we go through this step of the process of finding the behavior. We're using an older FireEye report on APT3. What we're going to do is just apply each of the steps of our process to this report. So first we have to find the behavior. We have to focus on what the malware, what the adversary is actually doing, those verbs. So let's walk through this. First one, successful exploitation. It's something that happened. Command, issuing a command could be a behavior. Looking at verbs again, creating persistence, creating a scheduled task. Establishing a connection. Sending a connection request. So we've gone through and identified some things that we think might be behaviors here. And what we'll do in the next steps of our process, identify the tactic and the technique that apply to each of those behaviors, and this mimics what you'll see in your exercise for this module. The next step of the process, researching that behavior. None of us knows everything, and so as an analyst, you might see something in a report, hey, I've never seen that before, I'm not quite sure what that means. That's fine. If your analysts don't know what something is, do additional research. That's what we as CTI analysts should be doing. Maybe talk amongst your team. I partner with a bunch of red teamers on my team who know a ton, and they're great resources about what adversaries might be doing. Or external resources. I'll walk you through Google, Wikipedia. There's so much out there in open source that can help you understand these adversary behaviors. And again, this might not always be quick. Maybe you spend 10, 20 minutes researching a single behavior, mapping a single technique, but then you know something you didn't before. And understanding what that behavior is will then help you follow through the next steps of this process. So let's take an example from our report. They mentioned SOCs. And maybe you've never heard of SOCs. That's okay. Go to one of the best websites ever, Wikipedia. So you bring up the Wikipedia article for SOCs, and it tells you it's an internet protocol, layer 5 of the OSI model. If you hadn't heard of the OSI model, great, look that up as well. Figure out what that means. Okay, so now we know it's a layer 5 protocol. We know a little bit more about SOCs, if we didn't know that already. We also saw in that report a mention of port 1913. I know I've never seen port 1913 used. When I've done this training before, most analysts had also never heard of that port. So we look it up, Speed Guide, a great source on ports, and the assignment is ARMADP, which I have never heard of, that service either, or that port. So maybe we need to do some more research, but right now we just know 1913 is something that I've never heard of, which gives you a piece of information to keep moving on with the process. So we have our behaviors and we've researched them, and now we want to translate those behaviors into a tactic, into those adversary goals. So to do this, think about the question, what is the adversary trying to accomplish? Adversary intent is really tough to know and their goals are very difficult to discern, but you can try to take a guess based on that behavior. Sometimes this is going to require some domain expertise, some knowledge of how adversaries behave in a network, but the great thing about mapping to attack from finished intelligence is sometimes there are clues in there, as we'll see during our exercise and in our examples. The good news about this step is that there are only 12 options to choose from as you're mapping to a tactic in enterprise attack. Initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, etc. So only 12 to choose from. Your odds are pretty good if you have some domain expertise that you might map to the right thing. And you can always ask your teammates. Let's take a look at how we apply this to our example report. Reading through, the malware establishes a SOC 5 connection. Moving on, the first 3 bytes of the command identifier. The commands are supported by the malware. So we summarize this into a simple statement like, the malware has to connect in order to command the malware to do something. And pretty straightforward here, that tactic would be command and control. The adversary's goal is establishing a connection and sending commands across it. So we've identified our tactic from our behavior. Next step of the process, figure out what technique applies to that behavior. This is often the toughest part of this entire process, made more difficult by the fact that not every behavior necessarily maps to a specific technique. So some of that is just knowing attack, knowing what techniques we have. That goes back to step 0 of understanding attack. But even if you don't know every technique, we have some simple strategies that can help you figure out how to successfully map your intel to attack, even if you don't know every attack technique in the book. First off, take a look at the list of techniques under the identified tactic. So as we'll talk about, we figured out in the last step in our example, that was command and control. So let's bring up that tactic page, and then we've narrowed down the techniques to choose from by a lot. Also, try searching our website, attack.miter.org. We have a search bar in the upper right. Try different keywords. Maybe you have some procedure level detail or some command line information, some flags that an adversary used, some specific commands or incident response details. Any kind of different keywords you can use to search through our website that might give you a chance at finding the right technique. Let's go to our example again. We decided that was the command and control tactic, so as I suggested, let's bring up that tactic page. This page lists all of the techniques under the command and control tactic. So we start scanning, and we notice something kind of interesting. We see there are protocol techniques and there are port techniques. That gives us a clue that though we identified kind of one tactic and a series of behaviors here, maybe there are 2 techniques for communication outside of a network, protocol and port. So that gives us a piece of information as we're trying to figure out what techniques apply here. Diving into our example details again, we see the malware first establishes a SOC 5 connection in that description. And we learned about SOCs from Wikipedia, so we try searching. Try a search of the attack website for SOCs and see what pops up. In this case, we got lucky, and we find that the term SOCs is in the description for the technique Standard Non-Application Layer Protocol. So we see that in the technique description. We also see one of our software examples, Bubble Wrap, was previously seen communicating using SOCs. So we have an idea, maybe SOC 5 connections map to Standard Non-Application Layer Protocol. But we also thought that maybe there's a port technique that applies here, since we saw on the tactic page that there are techniques for both port and protocol. So we take a look and just do a Control F on that command and control list of techniques, and we see there are 3 port techniques that pop up in that search: commonly used port, uncommonly used port, and port knocking. Out of these 3, I'd said I'd never personally seen port 1913 used by adversaries. Most other people hadn't heard of it, so out of these 3, I would personally select uncommonly used port. So we worked through the first behaviors that we saw, and we identified the tactics. For both of these, they were command and control, and then we identified the techniques. Establishing a SOC 5 connection, we said that would be Standard Non-Application Layer Protocol. And then using TCP port 1913, we mapped that to uncommonly used port. So we've taken our first 2 behaviors, mapped those behaviors to tactics, then mapped them to techniques. And so now let's continue through our report. Looking at successful exploitation to give system access. That's privilege escalation as the tactic. And then the technique would be exploitation for privilege escalation. The next one, using the Windows command cmd.exe whoami, we'd map that as the execution tactic because command line interface is doing that execution, and then also to the discovery tactic, system owner or user discovery for the who am I, where the adversary is trying to figure out maybe who owns or uses that system. Continuing on, this is where the finished reporting helps you out because persistence, which is one of our tactics, is right there in the description. So persistence is the tactic. And again, scheduled task is a technique name, so it's right there for you in the reporting. Pretty easy one. That brings us to exercise 2, where you're going to be analyzing a threat report to find the enterprise attack techniques in it. We have a report, open source, from Cybereason on Cobalt Kitty. And what we've done is we've gone through that report and highlighted sections for you, the different behaviors we want you to try to find techniques for. We've highlighted 22 of them in a PDF, and we want you to basically go through the process we've just outlined. Identifying the behavior, which we've given you a head start on, identifying the tactic, identifying the technique. So that's what we want you to do. All of the materials are in attack.miter.org/training/CTI under exercise 2. And you have a little bit of a choose your own adventure here. If you want more of a challenge, you can start with the highlights only PDF, which has just highlighted the behaviors for you. Or if maybe you want to ease into it, you can choose the tactic hints PDF, which gives you the hint of which tactic it is, and then you just fill in the technique. One note on this is that sometimes people have a little bit of a struggle figuring out which highlights correspond with which boxes. It doesn't really matter. Just focus on those highlighted sections and identifying the tactic and technique for each of them. You're welcome to fill it into the PDF or just use a text document, however you work best. A couple tips as you do this. Use keyword searches of our website, as we talked about, searching for something like SOCs, some procedure level details, or command line. Also remember, you don't have to be perfect. It's okay. This is a learning process, so use this as a chance to dive into attack. We now recommend you pause the video and give yourself about 30 minutes for this exercise, but we encourage you to take as long as you need to complete this. We now have an optional bonus step from exercise 2 that you should have taken a couple minutes to work through. As we talked about in our overall overview of the mapping threat intel to attack process, there's a step 5 that's really important, and that step is comparing your results to other analysts. Let's talk about why that's so important. As an analyst, as a human, I have my own biases. I often identify the techniques that I'm familiar with, so I see scheduled task all the time. I see spear phishing attachment all the time, so I'm more likely to identify those techniques. By comparing my results to other analysts, we can start to hedge against biases. On the attack team, we try to have at least 2 people review every report to try to put this step of the process into action ourselves. And it helps do a better job of identifying all the techniques in a report. So for example, maybe analyst 1 goes through a report and they see 6 techniques listed on the slide. Analyst 2 goes through a report and they see 5. Well, they compare those, they contrast those, and they see, there was one protocol technique they disagreed on. One analyst had standard non-application layer protocol, and one analyst had custom command and control protocol. That's okay. This is a great opportunity for them to discuss why are those different? What were their interpretations of what that behavior was? So this is a step of the process we highly recommend you follow if you have other analysts on your team. And again, we do this ourselves on the attack team. So that brings us to the optional bonus step of exercise 2. If you're going through this exercise as a team, which I highly recommend, compare what you got in the exercise to other analysts. And again, like I mentioned in that last slide, you're not going to get the same answers, and that's okay. Wherever there are differences, stop and talk about it. Discuss, what did you see? How did you interpret that behavior versus a different analyst? It is okay to disagree here. If you're doing this as a team, I'd suggest you please pause here for about 10 minutes to discuss your differences among analysts. If you don't have a team, that's okay. You can just advance to the next part of the training. Let's go over this exercise. Exercise 2, I asked you to map a Cybereason report to identify the different attack techniques in it, as well as the tactics. Some questions for you to think about, and if you're in a group, you can pause and discuss these. What were the easiest and hardest techniques to identify? How did you identify each of those techniques? What challenges did you have, and how did you address those challenges? So as we've done this training before, some of what we've heard on the easiest techniques were the ones that are really straightforward, like PowerShell or scheduled task. Harder ones, maybe user execution, that's commonly a difficult one. just because folks maybe don't know that technique or don't know that that's often paired with spear phishing. In terms of identifying the technique, we've heard a lot of folks using the search method of searching the attack website, as well as the tactic method of bringing up the tactic page, looking at those techniques. Another struggle we've heard on this exercise is just the overwhelming nature of attack. And we found a few people get analysis paralysis and get overwhelmed, but we found most folks can push through and just get started. Maybe it's not exactly right, maybe you're not sure of your answer, but diving into attack and understanding those techniques, that's the point of this exercise, and as you do it more, you'll get better at it. Let's talk through the techniques that we found in this report. Again, this is just one set of answers, and it's very possible that you got different answers. That doesn't mean you're wrong. If you can defend those answers, we're fine with that. So these are just the techniques that we found. First off, the report starts by saying 2 types of payloads were found in the spear phishing emails. First off, a link. So we map that to initial access as the tactic and spear phishing link as the technique. Then a separate type of payload, Word documents. Map that to, again, initial access, but spear phishing attachment instead of link. The third one, they noted that Word documents with malicious macros were found in those emails. We map that to defense evasion / execution, 2 tactics here, and to the very broad technique of scripting. This one sometimes trips people up because attack does have techniques that are at different levels of granularity, as we'll talk about throughout the training. But in this case, we map macros usually to scripting. The next one, 2 types of payloads were found in those spear phishing emails, so this is sort of an implied technique. In order to get those payloads to execute, the user was probably doing that, so we map it to user execution. This is often one that I forget even, or analysts are likely to miss, but generally whenever there's spear phishing attachment or spear phishing link, the method of execution is commonly user execution. Moving along, the next technique was in an image, cmd.exe, so mapping that to execution for the tactic and command line interface for the technique. Pretty straightforward one there. Next one, it's in the name, scheduled tasks, mapping that to execution / persistence and the scheduled task technique. Next, we have a snippet of command line, including mshta.exe. Maybe you're not familiar with that, but this happens to be one that we have by that name on the attack website. I say MSHTA. MSHTA is an execution or defense evasion technique. Next one, the act of downloading, executing an additional payload. We refer to this as the technique remote file copy under command and control. Moving right along, this is another image, and this is one of the easy ones, PowerShell.exe. Awesome, that maps to the execution tactic and the PowerShell technique. Next one can be a little challenging for some folks, passing an obfuscated and XORed payload. We put this under another broad technique, obfuscated files or information, which can refer to any kind of obfuscation or encoding. That's under defense evasion. The next one, a persistence techniques. This is where that finished reporting helps you identify the tactic. And then they mention the technique consists of registry auto run. This is where sometimes we just use different words for the same thing. In the attack, it's called registry run keys. That's another phrase for registry auto run. Next one, the attackers used NTFS alternate data streams to hide their payloads. We put that under defense evasion and NTFS file attributes. Again, thinking about the adversaries were trying to hide their payloads, that would direct you to the defense evasion tactic and hopefully that technique. Continuing on, the attackers created or modified Windows services. So I'd say that's 2 techniques under persistence. They created services, mapping to new service, or modify existing service, both of which are techniques. Next up, using a malicious Outlook backdoor macro, say that 5 times fast, to edit a specific registry value to create persistence. Again, the tactic name is right there in that information, so persistence is a tactic, and we bin that behavior under Office Application Startup, along with the defense evasion technique, modify registry. We'll talk about through the training what you've seen here about multiple techniques applying at the same time. That's not uncommon, especially when it comes to things like defense evasion or execution. Next one, using different techniques and protocols to communicate with C2 servers and specifying the HTTP protocol was used. CNC, it's right there, command and control is the tactic, and standard application layer protocol is the technique. We put HTTP under standard application layer protocol. Finishing up with our last couple techniques, the simple detail of traffic being over port 80. Again, that's command and control and commonly used ports. Port 80 is a very commonly used port by adversaries and legitimate traffic. Next up, downloading COM scriptlets using Reg Server 32. So downloading that, command and control, again, that remote file copy, bringing another file onto the system as adversaries often do. And then also Reg Server 32 is an execution technique by the same name. Next up, a binary was renamed kb10233.exe, trying to masquerade as a Windows update. Again, trying to evade defenses, so the defense evasion tactic. And then this is another easy one. We have a masquerading tactic that's fairly broad, referring to files or other information, trying to pretend to be something they're not. And then last but not least, network scanning against ranges, looking for open ports. We identify that as the discovery tactic. Adversaries trying to find out information about their environment, where they are, and specifically network service scanning. Again, that information right there, network scanning, will give you a hint for that technique name. That wraps up all the techniques in the Cyber Reason report. If you'd like a little more practice mapping finished reporting to attack, we have an optional bonus report for you on APT39. This is an open source report from FireEye, and you can find this under the same section, Exercise 2, in attack.miter.org/training/CTI. This time we're taking the training wheels off, so you don't have any tactic hints. We just have the highlights of the behaviors for you, and you'll need to go through that same process to identify the tactics and the techniques. We're not going to go through the answers here, but the answers are in a separate PDF for you to look at only after you finish the actual exercise, because I know none of you would cheat. As we wrap up this module, we've talked about this process of mapping CTI to attack, understanding attack, finding the behavior, researching it, translating it into a tactic, figuring out what technique applies, comparing your results. That seems like a lot, and maybe you think, hey, with something like PowerShell, I can skip right to step 4. I know what technique that is. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you can skip steps, but remember that increases your bias because you're more likely to identify those techniques you already know, and it's not going to work for you every time. Sometimes it works really well, like PowerShell or scheduled task, but if it's something that isn't an easy name, it's going to be tougher to find. So we recommend working through this process, even if sometimes you skip steps. As we wrap up Module 2, here's a reminder where we are in our training. We start out with Module 1, where we understood what attack was. Now we're talking about mapping data to attack. In this module, we've discussed how to map from finished reporting. In Module 3, Adam's going to discuss with you how to map from raw information, which is a little bit different than mapping from finished reporting. Then we'll move on to storing and analyzing that data, and the really important part, making defensive recommendations. That concludes Module 2.